Welcome welcome everyone to this exciting event of the Emergency Committee for Rojava, where we have three people, three activist journalists who have recently been in Rojava. Some of them spent there a very long time. So it will be a great opportunity for all of us to hear their reflections and to get some updates from the region. So I will introduce them quickly. And what's the order? Any preference?
Do you want to go first? Oh, fresh face.
Really?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so
you can fill in whatever blanks I have covered.
all right. So we'll have first we'll have Clara, who spent 2 years living in Rojava, working first with the Rojava Information Center and then spending time with the women's movement, including 7 months with Mala Jin, Kurdish for Women's House, the women's restorative justice system. She has just returned from Syria in the past few months and is excited to be in dialogue with people interested in the work happening there. So Clara, the floor is yours.
Okay. I think we will we're assuming some background knowledge and understanding, I think, with everyone of what's going on in Rojava. So I thought for most of my time, I'm just going to take about 10, 15 minutes. I would talk about the justice system and how the justice system is going, specifically the women's portion. But first, I'll just say that there are, because we're in the US and we're a very international group, but since we're in the US, I mean, the asks from the people on the ground for the US is definitely for the time being that the US military stay there. And I know for that's a complicated thing, US militarism within the US landscape, but that's definitely the ask from the people on the ground. And that also the autonomous administration receives more political support and political recognition from US bodies. I mean, ideally the US government. And that is one thing that we could do, start to organize electoral politics, put pressure on Congress to start introducing bills along that line. But I will mostly talk about the justice system. So the justice system in general is based on principles of restorative justice. So the idea at every level of the justice system is that before there are laws in Rojava, a lot of the laws about things that are really sort of very important and basic, like murder and women's rights and things like this. These were rewritten at the beginning of the revolution. But a lot of other laws, it takes a long time to build up all the laws that you need as a society that exist are the laws that are in the Syrian code already. And so the goal of the justice system is to come to a restorative justice reconciliation solution between parties before it gets to court, and you have to get the law involved. And so there's lots of different mechanisms for that, for different types of cases throughout the system. So there's a trade reconciliation house. So if there's a dispute between traders and consumers, you can go there and have that discussion before it gets taken to the court and the law gets involved. There are, at the commune level, there's social reconciliation groups, which are meant to solve any disputes that might come up between people within the communes. When it goes across communes, right, as it does, sometimes that gets complicated. And there are many levels to that. And then for women's issues, or domestic issues, or for family issues in general, you have the Mala Jin system. Mala Jin is a Kurdish phrase that means women's house. And there are many levels of conversation that people have, ideally before it goes to court. So the way that it works is, first, say you're somebody who has a dispute with your husband, right? You have a difficult relationship with your husband, you feel like you're being abused, and you want support from the justice system, from the women's movement. First, you go to your commune, which is your sort of neighborhood level commune. They will have a social reconciliation committee, ideally, right? And as we know, on the ground, requires people to commit their time and energy, right? So sometimes these things are more functional than others. But ideally, you have a social reconciliation committee. You talk to them, see if you can find a solution. But in general, those cases, you go to the commune, talk to them, get a note, and then go to your local Congress Star office, which is supposed to be sort of a touch point for all women in the community to be able to receive support. So the Congress Star office is sort of like the first step, Mala Jin, right? So from there, you'll have a committee of women who will first talk to you, and then afterwards call your husband in to talk together, talk to him separately, talk together. You have a series of meetings until hopefully you come to a solution. And some sort of contract of how the behavior will change going forward. This is also for divorces, if you need to decide how your divorce will play out, or if you're underage and being forced to be married, things like this. Maybe your father will be brought in, right? And conversation will happen. And then there'll be an agreement, and that gets filed with the court so that there's a record of it. And that's really important, just so that they found over time, it's really important to keep a written record so that people can't be revisionist historians, right? And then at that point, that will be, then the Asayish or the Mala Jin themselves will check in and make sure that those agreements are being upheld. So that's like broad strokes how the system is supposed to work and how it does work. And I spent several months in the Mala Jin in Kamishlo, which is the oldest Mala Jin. It was founded even before the revolution was announced in 2011. And it is definitely functioning. Over time, people at the beginning of the revolution, people were very wary. There's a lot of questions of honor. It's like, I don't really want our business being, out there in the community, right? It's like brings a lot of shame on the family to go to the Mala Jin. But that is changing. And now you have men bringing cases, maybe their wife left with their children to be with another man, and they want to be reunited with their children or something of this nature. So you have men also now trusting the Mala Jin and coming. And all of the people who work at the Mala Jin are women, which is the women's house. And so they will support men also with their domestic disputes. So as we've come to sort of understand that it's really about the family, and the family really is the basis of the society in Rojava. People are very strong family values. The women in Mala Jin are sort of thinking about their work and everything and how that fits into the wider society and what purpose they serve. And in 2014, you may know, there was a women's law passed. This is a law that outlawed polygamy, it outlawed marriage under 18, outlawed a bunch of traditional customs, things like Hayrandin and Berdali and Zawaj Kushtina, like things that are embedded in the cultural code, and then gave a process to the Mala Jin to work through how to surpass these things in community, and people don't feel left behind. There's no backlash, ideally. And so the women's law was updated last year to include more things, more procedural things. Like there's this many days can pass before you have to take this step, or things like this. And that's sort of in general in Rojava, you see, like as the social contract was updated 2 years ago, people want procedural questions answered, right? So that they can know how to approach things and know how to move forward, so they don't have to spend time constantly always deciding things together, right? And so you're seeing that as a trend in general in the legal system of like, procedural things are getting more and more fleshed out and so clear for people. But also in that process, the bones of the women's law are the same, but they changed the name of it to the family law, actually, to reflect the purpose that it really was serving in the society, which is that, women aren't always the ones in the wrong necessarily. Also, they had some backlash against it being the women's law, right? So it's a little bit of strategy. The men are like, well, this is the women's law. It's like, well, look at it. You don't want your daughter married under 18 and, these things. So it's a little bit of strategy too, because one thing you learn from the Mala Jin is really working at the speed of the community, right? Like it can be very difficult to have to send people back into situations which are tough in their homes, but the community can only change so quickly. So it's also a little bit of strategy, like slowly changing at the pace that's sustainable. And one thing they're doing is they changed it to the women's law to be the family law. Also, because as we know, it's not just Rojava meaning West Kurdistan, but now this system is being applied throughout North and East Syria in many Arab majority regions as well. And so there are Mala Jins now operating in all 7 cantons, which includes Deir Zor, Raqqa, Tabqa. And it's the situation there is different, right? You can't, the whole idea of the revolution is to change with and for people, to change with and for the community. And so In Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa and Manbij, these laws are applied slightly differently. So there's a ban on polygamy, but this is really hard to implement just all of a sudden in Deir ez-Zor, for example, and it's not really implemented on the ground. Women have a place where they can go to Mala Jin to talk about it, right? But it's not. They're applied sort of differently. Some people in Kamishla were like, "All the laws only apply to us," like this, but. So sometimes people like move away to try to avoid it, and you have this dynamic happening within the society, or they keep one of their wives in in Raqqa so that like the Mala Jin can't keep track of them, because there's also just resources how do you keep track of all of this? Resources they don't have they also they're not paid that much to work in the Mala Jin. They do get paid, but it's less than the autonomous administration like sort of baseline salary, at least when I was there a little bit ago. And that's just might be something that's changing. Everything is constantly in flux. They're changing things, right? At the Mala Jin conference last year, they made their sort of handbook, which has the rights and responsibilities and of all the people who work at Mala Jin. So everything is getting fleshed out, and that's a trend in Rojava in general. Like, what is the procedure? What are we doing here? We can't just be constantly asking each other and trying to figure it out all the time, and we don't have time for that. And there's war. You got a lot going on. And people like to feel comfortable and secure in the structures that they're operating within. Yeah. Oh, also just like kind of fun story. It's like people from Germany, couples in Germany, like Kurdish couples in Germany would call the women in the Mala Jin and Kamishlo. And they were kind of doing like cross-border work, They're like, it was like one of the women, she kind of turned to me and winked at me. She's like, "We're international." Mala Jin's international. So, it's the Kurdish community across the diaspora is definitely, aware of it. And so, yeah, I would say that's probably a good, if anyone has any questions, for sure, happy to answer that. But it's great. So sorry, I'll just say one more thing, which is like a lot of times we talk back and there's difficulties, like the cooperative system has difficulties, right? Communes have difficulties. Maybe it's difficult for people to engage as much as you would need. So you need to do a lot of political education. One thing that is really working is the Mala Jin. The women's movement and the restorative justice system it's really working. There's a resource constraint. You can't get into every single household. You can't be everywhere. That's what political education is for, and that's also an integral part of the Mala Jin. They go out into the community, talk to people, educate themselves. But it's really a bright light, and something that we should really fight for to be continued, whatever happens in the future, and to be spread to other places in the region, honestly here, right? So it's a real bright light. And I offered a bunch of complicated things just to consider when we think about how these things get built. But yeah, it's great. A really wonderful experience. Yeah.
I just have one question. Like, are they still doing this thing where they label certain areas of society women's issues? Like, when I was there, they had labeled media as a women's issue, and that meant that women were in charge of all the leadership roles in defining what kind of media work was happening and how.
Oh, that's very interesting. Not that I saw. Now, though, and that's interesting. I had just written this down also. Now there's Jin TV. So there's women's TV, which was very powerful for me because I worked in TV here very briefly. And when you go into Jin TV, it's just women, even behind the controls. And I was like looking around like, where's the men? And there was no men. They do everything. So and that's, that can be whatever, because you don't want to separate out and be like, okay, then no one watches Jin TV or something like this, right? Like you don't want that to happen. But that's not what's currently happening yet. So I don't know. In that way, I didn't hear about it conceptualized in that way now, but there are, again, like much more systems now, and Jin TV has its own channel. They have news, they have everything. So it might have been a direction that went. I don't know.
So I am going to make the suggestion that we hear from all the speakers, and then we will get questions. That's okay, but we'll go that way so we get to hear, and maybe you'll get to know who you want to address your question to. So next we'll have Arthur Pai, who is a writer and community organizer based in the Pacific Northwest. He's a member of the Emergency Committee for Rojava. I have to announce happily that now a steering committee member of the Emergency Committee for Rojava, and he recently spent 1 year living and conducting research in North and East Syria. So the floor is yours, Arthur.
All right. Thank you, Özlem. Yeah, I'll try to keep my section sort of short so that we can hear from others, but also especially since we can have more time that way to engage with questions that people have. So yeah, as Özlem mentioned, I recently returned from spending 1 year in Rojava, roughly. And in my time there, I was really lucky to experience a lot of different aspects of the movement, traveled different kind of from one end of the region that's now under the purview of what they call the Autonomous Administration of North East Syria to the other. But also kind of within society, I was really fortunate to spend a bit of time with members of different communities, members of different organizations, institutions, things like communes and cooperatives, alternative justice institutions, autonomous women's institutions, as well as also interviewing members of the Syrian Democratic Forces. So I have a few things I'd like to mention that are just kind of highlights that are coming to my mind today. And then again, very much interested in hearing questions that people have. First, I would say kind of overall, I've come home with this big impression of kind of this two-sided feeling about Rojava. On the one hand, it was just incredibly inspiring. And that what was inspired about that was the revolution, right? Here we are in the middle of Syria, and all kinds of different communities, people from all walks of life are coming together, and they're really building a new society based on these fundamental principles of direct democracy, of women's liberation, of social ecology, of cultural diversity, pluralistic society. Also, at least an aspiration to create a new kind of economics, what they call a social economy. So really a far-reaching, holistic revolutionary movement, which I thought was just incredibly inspiring, especially given the circumstances under which these communities are having to organize. At the same time, it was frankly a very heartbreaking experience, right? Because of the conditions that people are facing. And some of these conditions had to do with just the situation on the ground, things that are generalized for the region as a whole. But a lot of the problems that communities are facing in Rojava are frankly a direct result of the revolution and the hostility that they face, especially from the Turkish state, as well as continuing hostility from ISIS. Specifically because of the revolution, because they advocate women's rights, because they're trying to build a grassroots democracy, because they're trying to bring diverse communities together who for generations and generations have been warring with each other to build a kind of pluralistic society, right? So it's really this kind of two-sided impression that I have coming home. This like revolutionary hope and inspiration, which really still fills me, especially coming home to a very different context. But also, again, just kind of the heartbreaking devastation that communities are facing there at the same time. And I think it's in that context that the autonomous administration, which, you know, we say autonomous administration, it sounds like it's a very institutional kind of official name, right? What that is, for those who aren't familiar, right, is it's a federated structure of governance, or self-governance rather, which works the opposite of like a nation state government that we're all familiar with. I know people here are familiar with the topic broadly, but right in Rojava, governance starts at the neighborhood, at the block level, and it works its way all the way up. So when we're talking about the autonomous administration, we're not talking about a sort of isolated, centralized, bureaucratic government in a secret, smoky office somewhere deciding things for everybody. When we say the administration is faced with this, the administration is faced with that, we're talking about the federated councils of the people, starting from the bottom all the way up. But what this federation, what this administration is faced with is basically having to make this difficult balance every single day between these two tensions. On the one hand, They have these revolutionary aspirations to build this new society, which is incredibly ambitious in its scope. And on the other hand, they have to deal with the immediate needs of survival, right? So there's like a balance between long-term transformation and immediate survival. So at the end of the day, people got to eat, people need clothes, people need shelter, just like anybody else. And this is a region that's under embargo, right? They're not just facing physical attacks for as a consequence for the stand that they're taking on these issues. They're also facing economic isolation, still diplomatic, political isolation. And these things cumulatively are having real material effects on people's way of life. It's a lot of people are still struggling. And when people face these material hardships, it's also that much more difficult to organize a revolution. But still, all that said, people every day are like resisting with a smile on their face that's incredibly infectious and just fills you with hope. Okay, moving on. One of the things that happened when I was there, and presumably when Clara was there as well, of course, we've all heard about the devastating earthquake that happened in February 6th, I believe it was, of this year. And when this earthquake happened, I was in Kamishlo, which is actually very far from anywhere where people were hurt by the earthquake. Of course, we had to run out of the buildings. We felt it, but nothing collapsed in Kamishlo. But over on the other side of Syria, in Aleppo, in Halab, things were not like that. A lot of buildings collapsed, a lot of people were killed, and that was incredibly devastating. And for those that don't know, within Aleppo, which is it's a huge ancient city that we've all heard of, there is a small pocket of a Kurdish majority neighborhood on top of a hill that's called Sheikh Massoud. And that neighborhood, since the outset of the revolution, has remained autonomous. And that neighborhood, even though it's completely surrounded by regime forces, governs itself through the same principles and the same system as the rest of Rojava. And so when I went there with another journalist immediately following the earthquake, we went there to cover the impacts of the earthquake on communities. And I had heard about Sheikh Massoud. I heard that, the movement had a neighborhood within Aleppo, but I didn't know so much about it. And when we got there, realized that we're there to document what the effects of the earthquake were, which in many ways were the same kind of devastating effects that we saw elsewhere in Syria and of course in Turkey and North Kurdistan. But there was this whole other story that kind of emerged alongside it, right? And so the people that we had access to were the movement folks who were in Sheikh Massoud, in this autonomous Kurdish majority neighborhood, I should emphasize. And so what do? We go to the communes. We go to the local council. We say, hey, what's going on? How are people being affected? And while they report the same kind of issues, buildings collapsing, people being killed, people having to leave their homes because they're afraid that their building is going to collapse. Maybe it shook, maybe it cracked, and this displaced an enormous amount of people. But all along with that, they were speaking as members of the community. So they say, well, here's what we did. We have a commune. We have a local council in the neighborhood. In each commune, which is comprising maybe 150 families, we have people in each neighborhood that are accounting for every single family. They're checking in on every single family. What is their need? How have they been affected? Are they staying in their home? If they're not, what kind of space do they need? What kind of resources do they need? People hear sometimes in radical circles in the US, they talk about mutual aid disaster relief. People are familiar with this kind of catchphrase. To me, that came to mind as like, well, this is what that really looks like, right? In an incredibly systematic way. So it was tough to see the effects, but it's also really inspiring, again, to see how people were organized. So the co-chair of the commune told me, I'm paraphrasing, he said something like, here, we all work with one heart. Basically, like in other parts of even the same city across the line that was controlled by the regime, people were dealing with lack of supplies. Of course, this neighborhood was also isolated because the regime for 2 weeks refused to let emergency aid in. You can imagine this earthquake. People are living on the streets. People are in need of emergency medical care. For 2 weeks, the regime would not let in even blankets. But what they were able to do just with their organization and their social bonds and this structure of democratic confederalism was nonetheless incredibly inspiring. There was not a square inch of office space or any other corner of a building that could have been used that was not housing a family that needed it. So I wanted to share that story as kind of an example, not just of the everyday workings of the revolution, but how a society that's organized on these principles of like direct democracy is especially resilient in a time like a disaster. And I was so impressed by this that later on I had a chance to come back to that region, not just to Aleppo, but to northern Aleppo in a region called Sheba. And Sheba is a place where the people of Afrin have resettled. So those of you who know or don't know, in 2018, the region of Afrin, which was a stronghold of the Rojava Revolution, it was vastly Kurdish majority region, was invaded by the Turkish state in early 2018, and hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. Systematic ethnic cleansing took place, and a large number of these communities, they resettled just outside the zone that Turkey maintained control of and now occupies through their proxies in this place called Sheba. And because Afrin was a stronghold of the revolution, Sheba itself, even though a majority of people are displaced, they're living in refugee camps, villages that were formerly abandoned, it too, I would say, at least in my experience, is a stronghold of the revolution because of this incredible level of solidarity that people have, right? They all share this kind of these social bonds of being Kurds from Afrin. They're also majority families that have been a part of the Kurdish freedom movement in one form or another for decades. And then they just went through this displacement together. So even in refugee camps, and even if in like newly haphazardly rebuilt villages, they fought the revolution with them. So that's that resilience again. They have communes in refugee camps. They'll break a refugee camp into 5 neighborhoods and they'll create a commune for each neighborhood, and they'll bring a council together for the whole thing. So I thought it was really impressive. I got to visit the communes and the cooperatives there, the women's organizations, the people's self-defense forces, which are like grassroots self-defense of the neighborhoods themselves, which are actually totally autonomous from official military structures. And I just wanted to share, that's something that not so much is discussed in, especially in English, about what's happening with the Rojava Revolution in places like Sheba, in places like Aleppo, because you see how this model is resilient in all these different contexts. And I think that really speaks to what we all have to learn from what's happening in the rest of Rojava. And the last thing I want to mention is that nobody who spends time in Rojava can ignore the intense level of consistent attacks from the Turkish state. During the year that I was there were at least weekly or bi-weekly drone strikes. These are, unmanned, so to speak, aerial attack drones. For those who aren't familiar, these are aircraft constantly buzzing overhead that are carrying laser-guided missiles. And Turkey decides at the press of a button who they want to kill. And this is not just military targets. These are members of the autonomous administration, people like co-chairs of a local council, people like lifelong dedicated women's rights activists, people like members of religious and cultural minority groups, political leaders, everything in between. Turkey is systematically creating a climate of fear through these drone attacks. So when you're riding in a van, you're going down something like the M4 highway, which is this main drag from east to west in the center of Rojava, you never know if you're going to see or be a part of one of these drone attacks. And it's clear that the idea is not just about the people that they're assassinating, but about this climate of fear, the idea that you can't escape us, that even if we don't invade more of your lands and occupy more of your lands, we control the skies. But in face of that, again, people just keep organizing. They keep resisting. They're resilient, and we have a lot to learn from them. I think later we're going to maybe speak more directly to like the specific ongoing threats. But unfortunately, these days it goes without saying that Turkish President Erdogan is chomping at the bit yet again to launch another ground invasion. And I think it's really important, us as Emergency Committee for Rojava, those of us who are based here in the United States, to really think about, okay, maybe we're interested in this revolution happening in Rojava. Maybe we have a sort of philosophical, political affinity for it as a project conceptually. But I challenge us all to think about, what does it mean to be in solidarity with that movement in practice as people living in the United States? And that requires taking responsibility, for the role that the United States has to play in the region. Clara mentioned that, there's some messiness because there is a military relationship, because it just so happened that the enemy of the United States military in that region primarily is ISIS, and the most immediate threat to the Rojava Revolution before the Turkish state started invading was ISIS as well. So there's a political relationship there too. But it's also really important to mention that the US involvement does not end there, that every single one of these Turkish attacks that takes place, whether they're drone attacks, whether they're airstrikes, whether it's all-out invasions, whether it's the diplomatic cover that's being given to Turkey's policies within Turkey as well, going after the Kurdish freedom movement, everything that Turkey does, the US plays a role in facilitating, because Turkey is a member of NATO, and the United States has chosen to enable its behavior, look the other way when it goes after the Kurdish freedom movement, even if that contradicts its goals around ISIS. So I encourage us all to think about, what does it mean to put pressure on the United States government to take a more consistent position and principled position, even if we can't count on their intentions, right? To make it undeniable that social movements, that diverse communities here in the United States that care about this issue, and they demand that the US give political recognition and hold to Rojava and hold Turkey accountable for its crimes. These are US-made F-16s that are carrying out airstrikes. There are US parts in these drones that are carrying out these drone strikes. So we can't separate these things. I think I should stop myself there. There's a lot more to talk about. I think Anya also has a report back.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Thank you. And so the last report back is from Anya Briy, whom many of you know. She's the steering committee member of the Emergency Committee for Rojava, based in New York. Her writing on Rojava has appeared most recently in Jacobin, and also The Nation, Truthout, and other outlets. She just returned from a 3-month-long stay in Rojava, in the region of North and East Syria, we should say. Anya, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'll try to be very brief because I really want to hear your questions, and I want to hear Clara and Arthur's answers to your questions. But I thought a couple of things that I could mention, something that I learned during this trip would be the Pluralism project that the administration, that the movement has been building since the very beginning. Why I think that's important? Because in some sectors of the US left, I'm sure it's similar outside the United States, I hear sometimes, well, but the Kurds are infringing upon the rights of the Christian peoples who inhabit North East Syria. It's, there are a lot of groups that inhabit this one region. Or you hear people saying, well, the Kurds are occupying the Arab majority areas in North East Syria. And so I just wanted to talk to the Arabs, the Syriacs, the Armenians. I mean, I couldn't talk to every people, every community that who call this region their homeland, but I wanted to get a sort of a taste. What do people from other ethno-religious groups think about this project? And first of all, they get upset when we say Rojava, because it's a Kurdish word that means West Kurdistan. Why they get upset? Because they feel, they feel some ownership of this project. A lot of Syriacs, Arabs, Armenians with whom I talked to, they participated in building up the autonomous administration from the very beginning. For example, I talked to a Syriac woman who is a co-chair of the Syriac Union Party. And she said, look, even before the autonomous administration was founded, we as the Syriac Union Party that sort of was established at the outbreak, of the Arab uprising in Syria, the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, was established to protect sort of political, religious, cultural rights of Syriac people. And we were in communication. We were, talking to the Kurdish movement, talking to other components of the society, and we, discussed together this pluralist vision of a new political system to set up together. And they worked with the Kurdish movement on the social contract as well, right? So this very progressive founding document of the autonomous administration. And so they get, understandably upset when they hear in the media, oh, it's the Kurdish-led defense forces, or it's the Kurdish-led autonomous administration, or it's the Kurdish administration, because they are part of this project. They have been part of this project. And similar things I have heard from, the Arab individuals that I talked to who are actively participating, who participated from the very beginning. Some of them I talked to, they said, yeah, when the Arab uprising started, we sort of, and, not for all Arabs, life was sweet under the Assad regime, right? So a lot of the Arab tribes in North East Syria were marginalized before the Arab uprising. And so, a lot of them kind of got excited and joined the movement early on. They were part of building communes, cooperatives, TEFDEM, like unions, whatever. Like they really participated in building up all of the structures of the administration. And so, they really feel like this is not a Kurdish project. It's a project that all the different ethnic and religious groups have ownership of, right? Because a lot of groups see that it actually works to their benefit. Of course, there are people from all the communities. You can find people in every community that don't support the project, right? Or maybe they prefer a different alternative, for this region, for their own future. But that's not, religious thing. You can find the opponents of the autonomous administration within the Kurdish community too, right? So there are different parties within the Kurdish communities as well. So, and people have all kinds of reasons for not, supporting the autonomous administration. But from what I was able to tell from my communications with other ethno-religious communities, that a lot of them do support, and a lot of them see themselves represented, and they feel like this could really solve problems, not just for the Kurds of the region. Syriacs, Armenians, their rights were also marginalized under the Assad regime. So, as I said, Arab tribes, they were excluded, or like at least some of them were excluded from the power sharing arrangement under the Assad regime. So a lot of them do support it, and women in particular. And you didn't mention it this time, or maybe you did, right? So the Arab women, Syriac women, Armenian women, they really welcomed this project and started building their own structures that are kind of parallel to the Kurdish women structures, but they're autonomous. They just really welcome this opportunity and welcome this model, right? They openly tell you, look, we were watching the Kurdish women's movement from afar, and we figured, why? Well, like, why don't we do something similar within our communities? Mm-hmm. And that's what they did. So, oh my gosh, maybe I'll just stop here and we'll just do the question.
Tell us what made you laugh. If there is an example or something that you were no. No, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I was just saying, like, as I was saying that there's Mala Jin and Deir ez-Zor. I mean, that's not Kurdish women doing that. It's someone from Deir ez-Zor, right? They sit outside of the Mala Jin or the Women's House or the Genealogy Academy, with their guns, waiting for whoever shot it up last night to come because they're mad. Yeah. The women are doing this because their lives have been deeply affected and they're pissed. I mean, right? This is like, yeah.
Sorry, I'm asking if it's charging so that we don't lose power.
Yeah, it's okay.
All of a sudden.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay.
Yep.
So thank you so much. I am just gonna get a round of applause for Gordon and Arthur, everyone here. So we're gonna get some questions. We can take one from the room and one from the chat. So that's how we're going to go. Anyone in the room who has a question? I see Emre is on stack. And then somebody wrote a question that I can read, or they can raise themselves if they like. Emre, are you there to ask your question?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Clara, Arthur, Anya, for sharing your impressions and details from your time back in Rojava, North East Syria. I wanted to ask, I guess, begin with. I mean, I have a few questions in mind, but the first and main one that I was able to formulate is for Clara. You mentioned this fleshing out process going on. I was in the region 4 years ago, and this proceduralization wasn't like as widespread, and I guess the clashes were more prominent, so it was more military focused. I guess politics were more military focused as well. Could you give us more details about how that fleshing out takes place, especially in the context of the point Arthur made about how direct democracy is embedded or expanding in everyday life? So in that context, from your time in Mala Jin, can you share
Yeah, I
some?
think I won't maybe use an example from Mala Jin. I mean, what it comes down
like
to
the degree
Yeah.
that you can share, of course.
I understand your question totally. I think what it comes down to is just making sure that everybody is sure who is responsible for what in all different parts of the autonomous administration, right? Because like they're dealing with war, dealing with everything, you're dealing with your life, you're dealing with your family. Nobody has time to duplicate work everywhere. You want to make sure that you're working on the level of community, right? So you don't want to anonymize the government. That's not in the ethic of what people are trying to build, right? But you also want to make sure that you're being as efficient as possible. And so it's kind of a process of figuring out, well, wait a second, we were both doing that, right? So within the Mala Jin, it might just be literally jurisdictionally, like, okay, this canton will now be responsible for these towns, right? Or this municipality will not be responsible for these towns because this municipality is already doing that, right? Or these towns want to be independent, so it's not necessary for us to have conversations about them in our meetings because they're doing their own thing. Like that's kind of like the proceduralization. So there's a lot of geographical working out of like which canton encompasses which areas, and then also just figuring out who's responsible of what. So within the municipalities, there's two systems. There's the city council, which you can, it's changing and it's in flux, but I think a good way to conceptualize it is the city council is sort of responsible for people, right? It's responsible for the reconciliation councils, for the communes, for the youth development, for the sports, for helping you get your license, for and military conscription things. The young boys, if they want to go to school instead, they would go to the city council. But then you also have the municipality, which is responsible for the infrastructure, keeping the lights on. And that separating of those two things was a process that took kind of years. And in the most recent social contract, they just make it clear. Okay, well, wait a second. If we want to start a park, that's kind of for youth. Whose responsibility is that? We want to make a lot of trees. Whose responsibility is that? Things like this. That's kind of what the proceduralization is addressing. Like, who's responsible for what? And then it's clear, and then people can just go ahead and do their work instead of arguing about it potentially, like that. But I'm happy to talk about it more. Also, I can put my email in the chat and whatever.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Let me see. One question on the chat is, how do you actually think we as individuals take responsibility for what the US does, like actually practically? I can't get them to stop trying to genocide my people here, which is correct. So another one in Alaska, although our tribes already have a seat at the table as a sovereign nation alongside the US government, and we too live with the balance Arthur spoke of between ambitions and immediate survival needs. I'm in awe of your positive energy. So I guess we have the question of the US role, which is understandably a very big question given all the, injustices, the projects like Cop City, the environmental devastations that people are suffering here. I guess, Arthur, I'll leave the floor to you on that question of US responsibility and what can US citizens do.
Okay. And maybe Anya can kind of fill on any gaps because I know we work together on some of these things. I'm hearing this kind of as two-part. One is like, how do we struggle with kind of the very real contradiction that exists? Understanding that for those of us who have any kind of political affinity for the revolution in Rojava, we also, right, if we're paying attention, we see that the United States government is not an institution that reflects these values, puts them into practice, very much the opposite, right? So it's a matter first of kind of like reconciling how do we see that? How do we understand that? There would be one possible approach, right, which would say the United States is a force for good in the world, and it should live up to its promise of democracy and freedom by supporting autonomous administration. That's not how I see it. I think that's probably not how most of us at ECR see it. I think that from a strategic standpoint, the fact that the United States government professes these values, I think that that is something that we can use as leverage. But at the end of the day, I think it's more about the concrete material impacts of US policy on the region. And that you kind of, I don't know, Howard Zinn once said you can't be neutral on a moving train. I guess that's kind of how I see this. The United States government has a relationship on the ground. It's there. It's not up to us that it exists. And we, also to varying degrees, depending on like internal power dynamics within the United States. But those of us who live here also have some relationship with the United States government as well. So when I raise it just like on a foundational level, how I'm thinking about it is us interrogating, kind of challenging ourselves to answer the question, okay, well, if that relationship exists, how do I push and leverage my relationship to the US government in a way that will impact people on the ground in a positive way? So is there aid that the United States is already distributing in the region or in other regions, which it would be capable of distributing? I'm going to push for that if the communities there are saying we need these things to survive and we have no other option. And I think that in a lot of ways, that's analogous at every level, right? There's a matter of material aid. There's a crucial issue of the political relationship, political recognition. And there's the issue, the military situation, not only in the Syrian Democratic Forces being desperate for some kind of military aid in their operations against ISIS, but also to defend themselves against the Turkish state, but also in the sense of doing what we can to make sure that the United States is not actively arming an ultra-nationalist government in Turkey, which on the other hand is actively attacking the communities that we're in solidarity with. So the reality is full of contradictions, but when it comes to policies, halting all arms sales to Turkey. Right now, Biden is clamoring for Congress to support an additional sale of an entire new fleet of F-16 fighter jets to the Turkish state. I think we should actively oppose that, and we should leverage our relationships with the U.S. government as people who live here in that way. The U.S. has yet to ever give official political recognition to the autonomous administration as a kind of sovereign political body representing the people of that region. So there's a lot of other things that people can mention, but that's kind of the framework in which I see it. I don't want to talk too much more. No.
Please, yeah.
Not that, I'm obviously skeptical of the role of the United Nations as an effective body to do anything, but like, it has a role to play as, like, has the United Nations been leveraged, or has there been any effort to lobby it, to get international recognition for the autonomous administration?
Well, I don't know about that, like, I don't know all the details of what has been tried, but there is a sort of Geir Peterson, there is a special sort of I don't know what his exact title is, a special envoy for Syria, special representative for Syria to the United Nations. And there is a process to create a new Syrian constitution. And there's 150 members of this constitutional body, 50 neutral, 50 in support of the Syrian regime, 50 in opposition to the Syrian regime. There are 0 people from North and East Syria represented. Or I should say, not geographically, but 0 people who are, involved in the autonomous administration project. So that's very disappointing. And if you talk to people behind closed doors who are involved in the Syrian regime, or the Syrian regime process, the UN process with the Syrian regime, that's what they're like, this is dumb. I mean, it's just leaving out. And so I think that's one thing that we can say, like, hey, this doesn't make any sense. Like, it's not like the autonomous administration is a small place. It's a third of the country. It's a functioning thing. It has a very strong military force. So it doesn't make any sense the way the UN is approaching it. There's a lot of actors there involved, what have you. But the autonomous administration, and this is like another thing I wanted to say, which is that the autonomous administration, the ideology came out of the Kurdish freedom movement and everything, but now it really is a project for and by Syrians, right? Of all different colors, shapes, sizes. And so they're wanting this project as a model for a decentralized Syria, and they're actively working towards that, not for a Kurdish free homeland. And this is controversial within the Kurdish community, potentially, right? But the goal is a decentralized Syria. That is their political aim. And they have the Syrian Democratic Council. There's an office in Washington, if people aren't familiar, but the Syrian Democratic Council is sort of, in some ways, you can think of it as the answer to this UN constitutional process thing, actually bringing together representative Syrians from North and East Syria. They have an office in Washington, D.C. They work within the region in Syria, trying to reach out to other Syrians around Syria to say, hey, we have a pluralistic solution to the Syrian crisis. We're building it up. It exists, right? Let's just do it, right? And so that would be my answer to that. But that's maybe where.
So there is one more question in the room, and there are 2 questions on the chat, 2 or 3 questions on the chat. I just unfortunately we only have about 5 minutes because we need to go to the other section of our meeting, which is going to be quite important for our work here. But I will get your question and try to summarize the ones on the chat, and maybe I'll give each of you a round to just answer whichever aspect you like. Does that work? Okay. Dave, right?
Yeah, so Anya, you said that some people say that the Kurds are displacing, I think you said Christians. So could you say why specifically Christians as opposed to all of the other ethnicities that there are there?
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to just read the other one. So there's a question about the role of play, like song, dance, games, social activities, and how that those kinds of efforts build more political society. And then there's a question about the economy. Any progress on expanding the cooperative share of the economy beyond the macroeconomics? Okay, need to mute someone if I figure out who. So there's a question about the diversifying and industrializing of the economy and the relationships between the autonomous administration and the Syrian Arab Republic, between KRG and autonomous administration. So if anyone has reflections on these last three questions. It'll just be your conclusions as well, if you want to add anything. And actually, there's also a question to Arthur about the elections in Turkey and how people in the region of North and East Syria take that. So, Anya, do you want to start with the one on?
Yeah, just to clarify, not displacing, but basically like violating their rights or excluding them from the political system. And as I said, I mean, it's not, people don't say that it's just Christians, you know, who get left out. People also say it's Arabs, and I gave my understanding of what's happening. But with the Christians in particularly, what I learned from, you know, the Syriacs with whom I talked to is that the Syrian government, the Assad regime, uses this narrative as a propaganda tool. You know, over the years, didn't just start now, but the Syrian, you know, the Assad, the Ba'ath regime has been using, you know, the Christians of Syria as a, you know, as a token to show to the world, look, you know, we respect pluralism, we protect the rights of the religious minorities here. And so, you know, they had religious rights, as I was told by my Syriac, you know, interlocutors. They only had religious rights. They didn't have political rights. They didn't have, you know, they couldn't form a party, for example, and engage in politics, you know, as a Syriac community. But because they had the religious rights, and because there is this strong connection between the church, between the Christian church, Syriac, I mean, Armenians as well, and the Assad regime, so they basically, you know, reproduce the narrative that they received from the Assad regime. But also, that's one partial response. The other is, you know, they have undergone, you know, gone through different massacres, you know, as a Christian minority in this region. So for them, it's sort of like we don't want changes. You know, we had this safe space here, I mean, more or less safe space in Syria, and, you know, they're, you know, just there's just fear, you know, that they will be subjected to violence again if, let's say, they start opposing the Assad regime. So in case, just to your question, yeah, there is this narrative that's propagated, as I was told, by the Syrian government, but also picked up here, you know, when people who follow the media, and they don't necessarily know, yes, it's Syriac media, but it's the Syriac community that supports the Assad regime, so they reproduce that narrative.
Thanks, Anya. Let me see, Clara, do you have any reflections on that question of economy or the play aspects of moral community?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's a very beautiful question. I mean, I think like the spirit of what the revolution is trying to tap into is reflected just in that question itself, you know, in returning to those ways of being with each other, and asking that question. I guess the final reflection maybe is, because we didn't touch so much on our Indigenous friends who commented within the chat, which is just that when we think about strategic relationships or tactical relationships, let's say, with the US, I think the movement would really say that their strategic relationships are with the Indigenous communities here, right? Their strategic relationships are with the communities that are facing oppression on the same scale around the world, right? And so that is really the connection that we want to make. And then the tactical relationship being with whatever system is providing the weapons that is killing everybody, right? And in the way that we can. So that, you know, I think the friends in Rojava will be very happy that you're in the chat, very happy to share some of the struggle. I will, you know, pass along what you said to some friends in Rojava. So yeah, I guess that would be the reflection, is that's really what it's about, is making those connections. And then also in this sense of sort of, before, when I said that they're not looking to create sort of a Kurdistan, they're looking to create a decentralized Syria, it's because the ideology, the movement is anti-statist, right? And the ideology of the KRG, so I can mention that, is, you know, statist, to create a state. So the vision broadly, and it's very ambitious, you know, and we can all do our part to try to move the world a little bit further towards that direction, is sort of a decentralized, non-nation state based globe. And so when they're starting where they are, and that can be confusing for people, and it takes re-education. It's new ways of thinking about things. It's creative ways. It's playful ways, right? It's playful ways of thinking about our future and what's possible. So But yeah, that's what that means. Thank
Thank
you for
you.
being here.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna do a super rapid fire response to actually three of these different things. I just wanted to add on the question of play. I also think it's a wonderful question. If people are not familiar with this, the Kurdish freedom movement and broadly the movement in Rojava, it is a singing movement, it is a dancing movement, it is a movement that loves theater, and it's also a movement that loves sports, especially the youth movement within the movement. They create sports clubs, sports centers, and they're even having all these rigorous discussions about what would it mean to create like a kind of alternative sports ethic that is more humanitarian and anti-capitalist, which I thought was very fascinating. On the question of the elections, while I was there, while Clara was there as well, the last Turkish elections took place. For those who don't know, Erdogan was re-elected, if that's even fair language to use. It's not a country where you could say fair elections taking place when, you know, thousands of opposition activists and journalists, including the leaders of the main opposition party, are in prison. But it did take place. Erdogan starting his third term in power. There was a bit of hope that the opposition candidate, who was by no means a friend of the movement, would potentially win and open up some further space for negotiation. That didn't happen. So the movement's really bracing for what's to come, but nobody knows, of course. And then lastly, on the economy, there's kind of two pieces to this. One, there's a need to create just material self-sufficiency, right? Going back, people got to eat, people need shelter, people need clothes. And the movement under embargo can't get all the essential tools to create their own industry. So there are efforts to diversify agriculture. There are efforts to diversify industry, but the progress is very slow because they don't have access to a lot of things because of the embargo. But the other side of that is a more like political ideological goal, which is not just about about material self-sufficiency, but it's about creating a new kind of economy. Again, what they call the social economy. So the goal of the movement is not just to create an anti-state politics, but to create an anti-capitalist economics, an economics of cooperation of meeting people's needs. This also, for the same reasons, is experiencing slow progress because of just the reality, the needs to survive the conditions of war and embargo. But there are things like workers' cooperatives, women's autonomous cooperatives. There are places where the communes help a tremendous supplement a tremendous amount of people's basic needs in their neighborhoods. And then there's also even unionization efforts. So TEVDEM now is an organization that's unionizing workers. But again, it's a very slow transformation. It's undergoing a lot of hardships. I'll stop there.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm sorry to cut the question and answer part here, because that's only because we gotta, we have more to do. There's a lot more to discuss, and this is partly meeting, so we need to see what ECR, the Emergency Committee for Rojava's work, some of the ongoing work will be. And today we have a special and I'm going to post the recording here, stop the recording here,